Few passages of scripture are as brief and, at the same time, as unsettling as those that mention the Nephilim, giants of unusual stature, colossal beings who, according to ancient traditions, walked among humankind and left deep marks on the history of the world before the flood. For many readers, these lines pass unnoticed, almost like a strange detail amid the sacred text. But for those who read attentively, for those who dare to question what lies behind the biblical silence, these passages conceal something far greater than they appear. And among all the unsettling questions that arise, one is rarely asked aloud. If giants existed, did female giants also exist? Where are the traces of the so-called giantesses? Why do their names not appear in canonical records, nor even in the boldest speculations of traditional archaeology? Were they forgotten by time, or intentionally erased from collective memory? In this episode, you will be guided along little explored paths, ancient manuscripts, marginalized texts, and frequently overlooked evidence to investigate whether colossal women truly walked the earth. And if they did exist, their presence could profoundly alter our understanding of the role of the Nephilim and their influence on primitive humanity before the great judgment of the waters. The Nephilim is a topic that occupies a central place among the most intense debates in the biblical and historical universe, attracting both scholars and curious onlookers. The figure of the Nephilim inspires fascination and unease in equal measure, for it touches boundaries that challenge human understanding. The texts state that these giants arose from the union between the so-called sons of God, identified in ancient traditions as the Watchers, and human women. This narrative appears in Genesis 6 and echoes in other writings, such as the Book of Jude, which makes direct allusions to these transgressive beings. It is precisely here that the mystery deepens. If there was a hybrid race of giants, would there also have been a female counterpart? Did women of extraordinary stature share this world with male giants? The relevance of this question grows when we observe that both in scripture and in apocryphal texts and ancient mythologies, the giant is almost always portrayed as male. Even in cultures distant from one another, the archetype of the colossus rarely takes a female form. Thus, the silence surrounding the giantesses remains one of the most intriguing enigmas of antiquity. It raises the possibility that these figures were not non-existent, but perhaps omitted, distorted, or symbolically concealed. And it is precisely this absence, more than any assertion, that casts deep shadows over the true nature of the Nephilim and over what, ultimately, was preserved, and what was left out of the narratives that have reached us. For some ancient interpreters, the silence of Scripture regarding explicit accounts is not accidental, but a direct reflection of a world narrated from a predominantly male perspective. In this context, giants are described as men not only because of their strength or dominance, but because they represent archetypes of power within the symbolic and mythological framework of that time. The absence of female figures, therefore, would not indicate non-existence, but narrative invisibility. For other scholars, however, this silence echoes something deeper. They argue that the absence of any mention of giantesses is not merely literary, but theological. Perhaps these figures were never part of the established order. Perhaps they were impossible within the limits imposed on creation. Or perhaps their existence was considered so aberrant that it did not even merit record. The text, in this case, does not speak because it chooses not to speak. This gap, far from closing the debate, has become one of the most intriguing points in ancient scripture. Over the centuries, attentive readers, theologians, and those who seek to understand the hidden mysteries of the Bible have wrestled with this question. The nature of the Nephilim and the possibility of their female counterparts has fueled interpretations ranging from conservative rigor to bold speculation. None offers definitive proof. None brings the matter to a close. What remains is the mystery. What we have are hypotheses, echoes of ancient traditions, fragments of narratives preserved outside the biblical canon. One of the most recurrent theories holds that the Nephilim were hybrid beings, born from the forbidden union between the Watchers, angels who transgressed their appointed boundaries, and human women. If such a union was possible, then the existence of giantesses, at least in theory, cannot be dismissed. But how would they have been conceived? Would they have inherited the same strength, the same tragic destiny? Or would they have occupied a hidden role, erased from collective memory? Within this perspective, giants cease to be merely men of great stature and come to be understood as beings outside the natural order, products of a crossing between distinct natures. This would explain not only their extraordinary strength, but also their unusual longevity. Scripture records men living between 500 and 900 years, such as Methuselah, who reached 969 years, and Noah, who lived 950. Even so, these figures were already considered extraordinary exceptions. Those who defend the hybrid nature of the Nephilim argue that their biological and spiritual constitution placed them beyond even these limits, allowing them an even longer lifespan. According to this reading, giants could live up to 3 times longer than ordinary humans of their era, a detail that reinforces the idea that they were not merely large men, but something radically different. Still, such extraordinary longevity may have carried a hidden cost. Some traditions suggest that as these hybrid beings aged, they became progressively sterile. The vitality that sustained their colossal bodies did not necessarily translate into the ability to generate life. Over time, the flame of reproduction would be extinguished, cutting off any possibility of natural continuity. Under this interpretation, the Nephilim would not merely be hybrids, they would be a branch doomed to extinction from its very origin. If this hypothesis is correct, the giants could not produce offspring among themselves. There would be no succession, no lineage. The end would be inscribed in the very bodies of these creatures. Within this line of reasoning, the idea of giantesses loses its practical function. If giants were incapable of reproduction, the existence of a female counterpart would serve no biological or historical purpose. The Nephilim would thus emerge as a temporary deviation from the order of creation, permitted for a time, but destined to vanish without leaving heirs. It is at this point that one of the greatest divergences on the subject arises. Was the sterility of the giants a real limitation imposed by their hybrid nature? Or are we facing yet another silent omission in ancient narratives? Were giantesses biologically impossible or simply erased from recorded memory? These questions continue to divide scholars and remain without definitive answers. A second perspective, however, challenges this conclusion and reopens the debate. According to this line of thought, antiquity may have known not only male giants, but also women of similar stature. Giantesses who walked alongside these colossal beings, sharing their origin, their strength, and perhaps their fate. This theory arises from a simple and almost unavoidable logic. If giants truly stood between 3 and 5 meters tall, as ancient traditions suggest, union with human women of ordinary stature would have been physically improbable. The discrepancy between such radically different bodies would have made these relationships difficult to sustain, leading to the conclusion that, if reproduction occurred, it would have required partners compatible in size and constitution. Thus, the existence of giantesses would cease to be a fantasy and instead become a functional necessity within that ancient world. This hypothesis gains even more strength when we observe the role of women in biblical and historical narratives. Genealogies rarely mention them, not because they were irrelevant, but because the world that recorded history was profoundly patriarchal. Name, inheritance, and memory were transmitted through men. Women, though essential to the continuity of life, often remained in the shadows of the text. This invisibility was not the exception, but the rule. Narratives exalted deeds, battles, and male lineages, while female figures were relegated to the margins of historical record. Thus, the absence of giantesses in scripture may not signify non-existence, but silence. Therefore, when interpreting ancient passages that mention giants, many scholars observe that scripture's silence regarding giantesses may be directly linked to the very structure of the world in which these texts were recorded. It was a deeply patriarchal society where names, deeds, and genealogies were preserved almost exclusively through male lines. That which did not serve to affirm authority, inheritance, or dominion was rarely written down. In this way, the absence of references to female figures among the giants should not be understood as a denial of their existence, but as a reflection of the narrative limitations of an era that recorded only what it deemed essential. Within this perspective, the possibility of giantesses emerges not merely as a logical biological hypothesis, but as a coherent reading of biblical silence. Scripture frequently mentions sons, men, and lineages, while women remain hidden between the lines, even when they played fundamental roles in the continuity of human history. Thus, the erasure of the giants' female counterparts may reveal more about those who wrote the texts than about who actually existed. By considering that giantesses may have lived, this theory offers a broader understanding of the perpetuation of the Nephilim. Rather than creatures arising from isolated events, the giants would be the product of a more complex system involving union, generation, and continuity. Even if the preserved accounts focus solely on the males, female lineages would have been equally decisive for the expansion of this hybrid race that crossed eras and left deep marks on humanity's collective memory. This understanding finds echoes in the mythologies of many ancient peoples. In cultures far removed from one another, giants rarely appear alone. In Greek tradition, the Titans did not exist merely as brute force. They formed families, had spouses, and produced powerful offspring. In Norse legends and other ancestral traditions, women of extraordinary stature and uncommon strength appear as a natural part of the mythical world. These similarities suggest that the idea of giants accompanied by female figures belonged to a shared ancient imagination rather than being a late invention. In this way, the omission of giantesses from biblical texts can be understood as a direct consequence of the narrative focus of the time, which exalted male power and the patriarchal transmission of name and inheritance. Women, human or otherwise, were often relegated to the shadows, not because of irrelevance but because of cultural choice. Silence, in this case, does not erase existence, it merely conceals it. Ultimately, this reading reinforces the idea that the absence of records does not equate to non-existence. For many proponents of this view, giantesses would have been essential figures in the history of the Nephilim, even if never named. Their exclusion from scripture would reflect a narrative decision, not an ontological denial. There is, however, a third perspective that emerges from ancient reflections, that the giants may have been sterile. This view dialogues with earlier interpretations, but adds important nuances. According to this theory, hybrid beings would carry limitations inherent to their origin, even if they possessed extraordinary strength and longevity. Just as the men of the earliest ages lived for centuries, Adam, Noah, Methuselah, the giants, by virtue of their singular nature, may have exceeded human temporal limits even further. Such extremely long lives would render perpetuation through descendants unnecessary. From this standpoint, the absence of references to giantesses would not indicate cultural omission, but rather the simple irrelevance of reproduction for creatures that did not depend on it to remain in the world. This possibility opens a path to understanding the giants not merely as colossal physical forces, but as prolonged temporal existences, whose presence spanned human generations without ever needing to leave heirs. In this context, the giants come to be understood not only as beings of immense strength, but as entities that transcended the common limits of human existence. Some texts and traditions suggest that they may have been immortal, or at least endowed with an extraordinary longevity, capable of spanning centuries, perhaps millennia, without the need to generate direct descendants. Their persistence in the world would not have depended on natural succession, but on an almost unnatural resistance to time, as if the very clock of creation moved more slowly for them. This interpretation becomes even more intriguing when we observe that giants reappear in Scripture even after the flood. The judgment of the waters is described as total, intended to wipe all flesh from the face of the earth, except Noah and those with him in the ark. And yet, generations later, the accounts once again mention giants, raising an unsettling question. How could something so ancient and condemned survive the greatest act of purification ever narrated? Among scholars who defend this view, the most recurrent explanation points to the return of the Watchers, the fallen angels, after the flood. According to this hypothesis, even after divine punishment, these beings would have descended once more to earth and repeated the ancient sin, again uniting with human women. From this transgression would have arisen a second manifestation of the Nephilim, distinct from the former, yet equally marked by strength, violence, and spiritual imbalance. This time, however, something had changed. The world's tolerance seemed diminished, and the age of the giants was beginning to draw to a close. After the flood, giants still appear as feared figures, but their presence becomes increasingly rare. Wars intensify, kings rise up against them, and battles are fought not only against men, but against what remained of an ancient race. One striking example is found in the account of a primitive war in which several nations unite to confront different groups of giants. The biblical text records that, despite their strength, they were defeated. For the first time, giants cease to be merely symbols of terror and begin to be seen as vulnerable. This pattern repeats itself throughout Scripture. The famous story of a young shepherd facing a colossal warrior does not stand alone in the sacred text. It echoes a broader process, a slow decline. Goliath represents the final peak of a lineage that no longer ruled the world as it once had. His fall was not merely the victory of an unlikely man, but a sign that that era was drawing to a close. Goliath, though imposing and revered, was no longer invincible. His defeat symbolically marked the end of a cycle that had begun long before the flood. Yet even as giants gradually disappeared from the biblical stage, their memory remained alive in ancient cultures. Many of these beings continue to be remembered as almost divine figures, primordial heroes, or agents of destiny. Mythologies across the world preserved echoes of this memory. Giants appear as builders of civilizations, legendary warriors, and figures who moved between the human and the divine. This reverence reveals not only fascination, but an acknowledgement of a power that, for ancient peoples, surpassed the limits of human understanding, a grandeur that still echoes in the collective imagination today. In many of these ancient cultures, giants did not occupy only the place of fear, but also that of reverence. They were seen as beings who walked along the boundary between the world of men and the realm of the divine. When narratives describe encounters between humans and giants, they almost always do so within an atmosphere of silent awe, as if the mere presence of these creatures were a reminder that forces beyond ordinary comprehension existed. They were not merely monsters, they were living signs of an ancient order, one that preceded known civilizations. In Greek myth, this tension is clearly visible in the stories of great battles between generations of powerful beings. The Titanomachy, the war between the younger gods and the primordial titans, portrays the confrontation between a new order and an ancient power that refused to disappear. There, giants are not merely enemies to be destroyed, but symbols of a former age marked by brute force, grandeur, and chaos. Victory over them represents not only physical dominance, but the replacement of an old world by another seeking balance. From this perspective, The titans and giants of mythology would not be purely symbolic creations, but distorted echoes of a real ancestral memory. Ancient peoples, scattered after cataclysmic events such as the flood, would have preserved these memories in different ways. Over generations, what was once history transmitted orally was reinterpreted, mythologized, and imbued with local cultural elements, giving rise to pantheons, divine wars, and epic narratives. In the biblical tradition, this ambiguity also emerges. Giants appear as the result of a forbidden union, the sons of God with the daughters of men, carrying within themselves both the mark of heaven and the fragility of flesh. They inspire fear, but also fascination. Their existence reveals a world in which the supernatural still touched the human directly, where boundaries were crossed and inevitable consequences followed. Over time, however, the presence of giants begins to fade from historical narratives. This disappearance does not occur abruptly, but like the gradual extinguishing of an ancient flame. Wars, successive defeats, and the weakening of the lineages associated with these beings mark the closing of a cycle. As human civilizations grow stronger, giants cease to occupy the center of the world and move to the margins of memory, transforming into legends, symbols, and warnings. This decline does not imply that giants were invincible. On the contrary, the sacred texts themselves are careful to show their limitations. Confrontations such as that of David and Goliath do more than recount an improbable victory. They reveal a deeper truth. Strength without purpose does not guarantee permanence. Many interpreters see in these clashes more than physical battles. They discern representations of the confrontation between faith and arrogance, between obedience and rebellion. Thus, the fall of the giants symbolizes something greater than the end of a race. It reflects the transition from a world governed by fear to a world shaped by trust in the divine. The rise of human heroes in the face of these colossal figures points to the triumph of courage, faith, and submission to the will of God over unrestrained and purposeless power. This historical and spiritual backdrop opens space for even deeper reflections on the nature of the giants and their relationship with humanity. Some ancient traditions suggest that, at a certain point, these beings united with human women, generating hybrid descendants, a possibility that further expands the mystery surrounding their origin and prepares the ground for the interpretations that follow. Even so, the concept of giantesses, or female figures belonging to the race of giants, remains shrouded in silence and controversy within ancient sources. The records preserved over the centuries focus almost exclusively on male giants, their deeds, their battles, and their strength, while the possible female figures of this lineage remain hidden, unnamed, and undescribed. This narrative void raises a fundamental question. Does it point to non-existence or to omission? In Scripture, as in many ancient texts, history is told from a deeply patriarchal perspective. Genealogies emphasize fathers and sons, kings, warriors, and heroes dominate the focus, while women, even when essential, appear only at the margins of the account. In this context, the absence of giantesses may reflect less a biological reality and more a cultural bias, a narrative choice that prioritized the masculine as the bearer of memory, name, and power. In light of this, it is legitimate to question whether the silence of the texts truly amounts to a denial of existence. The lack of explicit mention does not constitute definitive proof that giantesses never existed. On the contrary, it may indicate the limits imposed by the perspective of those who recorded these stories, shaped by the social structures, religious values, and literary conventions of their time. To move this reflection forward, it is necessary to go beyond a literal reading, considering the cultural, historical, and symbolic context in which these texts were written. The debate over the possible existence of giantesses, and even of giant societies composed of both sexes, remains alive among scholars, theologians, and researchers of ancient traditions. Some propose that the relationship between giants and humans may have been far more complex than a simple conflict, involving alliances, coexistence, and even mixed lineages. Other theories expand the horizon even further, suggesting that giants were hybrid beings, born from the union of the divine and the human. An idea present not only in the biblical tradition, but also in mythologies across many cultures. This interpretation casts giants as symbols of transgressed boundaries, but also as witnesses to a time when heaven and earth seemed closer to one another. Now we leave this reflection open for you. What do you think about the stories of giants? Do you believe that giantesses may have existed, even if silenced by ancient records? Or do you consider it possible that giants, both male and female, formed families, clans, or even their own societies? Or perhaps you find meaning in the idea that these beings were hybrids, carrying within them both the human and the divine. We invite you to share your perspectives in the comments. If this journey through the mysteries of giants, revealed in scripture and ancient traditions, has edified you and expanded your understanding, show your support by liking and sharing this content. By doing so, more people can be reached by this profound reflection that crosses faith, history, and sacred imagination. And stay with us. The next video in this series, available at the end of this episode, will bring revelations and theories that will surely surprise you. Thank you for walking with us this far. May God bless you, and I'll see you soon.